All right, folks. Hello and welcome back to online English class. I hope you guys are doing well today. Today we're going to be finishing up our work on OTN 3 as you work on your outline, which should establish a clear central claim in response to the prompt, and then a series of supporting assertions with evidence to support those assertions. Okay. So before we do that, before we finish up OTN 3, sort of bring our work together, let's look through the top of the week announcements together. Okay, so make sure that you are completing your discussion grade procedure on a daily basis. That's enough about that. Okay, make sure that you are completing your OTN 3 and submitting it to me by today at 3 p.m. All right, I need that outline. Okay, so remember, I'm not asking you to do any more than that. I'm not asking you to do any less than that. I need the outline of your argument. Okay, your central claim, your supporting assertions, and your evidence. Okay, after we complete OTN 3, we're going to be engaging with one last content lecture that's going to describe how to incorporate sources effectively in synthetic writing. Okay, that's going to be useful on your Unit 6 test and also on your Quarter 4 essay. Then we're going to be taking that Unit 6 test on Monday and Tuesday of next week, spending Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday of next week talking about your Quarter 4 essay and thinking about what it needs to look like and what I'm going to be looking for as I'm grading it. Aside from that, if you're done with your Unit 8 progress check, which you all should be by now, by today, it was due yesterday by 3 p.m., ultimately, your only task left is to finish OTN 3 and begin preparing for your Unit 6 test. Okay, so in light of these things, let's go ahead and jump back into our third OTN. All right, so essentially, as you are constructing your outline and responding to this prompt, it's important for you to return to the prompt and understand what on a basic level you're being asked to do. Okay, you can't offer a coherent central claim without understanding what is the most foundational question that you need to be answering in that claim, right? And that is ultimately how John Brown should be memorialized, how he should be remembered. In a sense, this is an evaluatory essay. You are evaluating John Brown's actions, looking back on them, putting him back on trial, and judging the actions of John Brown. All right, so as any valid judgment ought to have, you need to have criteria by which you judge John Brown's actions. Okay, so it is your job to establish a kind of coherent criteria that you are going to measure John Brown's actions by. Okay, establishing that criteria is something that I haven't done for you. Okay, it's something that you need to be doing independently. But at this point in the year, a lot of this work is independent work, especially this prompt, which requires careful thinking, all right, careful judgment about the not only what John Brown did and why he did it, but how his intentions and his actions square up with the definition of justified violence and authentically heroic American attempts to rectify and justify unjust laws or norms in our society. Okay, so the first two sources that we looked at, obviously, were created by John Brown himself, right? And he characterizes himself as a man who did what he did because of his deep belief both in the natural laws articulated by Thomas Jefferson in documents like the Declaration of Independence, the self-evident truth that all men are created equal, and also the God who instituted those laws, right? So in his view, what he did was just an outworking of his most deeply held beliefs, all right? The problem is the way that he worked those beliefs out. The trouble is the way that he worked those out were violent. The way that he worked those out cost other people their lives. The way that he worked those out were against social norms, social customs, and indeed laws. All right. So how do we justify that? Well, we see a very clear justification of that in Henry David Thoreau's argument, A Plea for Captain John Brown, in which he argues that John Brown's actions and his violence, okay, even given his violence, Thoreau doesn't shy away from the fact that Brown fought, that Brown killed, that Brown Brown's actions led to people dying, blood being spilled. He says those actions, right? Those violent actions, those abnormal actions, those illegal actions are justified because they were done in obedience to the natural law that all men are supposed to follow, are supposed to align themselves with. And when those men's government does not align with those things, it ought to be disobeyed and ought to be radically, which is to say, if necessary, violently altered and abolished. Brown, in that sense, is a kind of American hero for Thoreau. Right, but at the tail end of his speech, he sort of begins to wax eloquent from a transcendentalist perspective, but just very simply, right. In the beginning, I think the most relevant portion of his argument is the argument that if the government becomes tyrannical, disobeying the government becomes virtuous. Okay, this is a nice counterpoint for that seemingly simple and argument in favor of Thoreau is articulated by Tony Horowitz in his op-ed, The 9/11 of 1859. Okay, so today I want to look quickly at Tony Horowitz's argument, all right, and raise some of the questions and discuss some of the questions that he raises in this op-ed and expand on his argument just a little bit by reading some of the implications of some of the things that he's said. Okay, so the rhetorical situation of the document it was written in the 21st century after 9/11. Okay, and it's in 2009 during the ongoing war on terror. Okay, now Tony Horowitz is writing this document to compare the actions of John Brown to the actions of the radical Islamic terrorists working for Osama bin Laden in correspondence with the terror cell Al Qaeda in order to basically terrorize American society and Western society as a whole, to try and initiate some kind of holy war between the Islamic jihadists and the rest of the wicked world that they believe need to be destroyed and overcome to establish a kind of caliphate, a kind of righteous rule of the world that will initiate the end times, the coming good rule of the rightly guided caliph. Okay, so that's the theology of the radical Islamic terrorist, and very like that radical Islamic terrorist, John Brown believed that he was engaging in some kind of holy war. Okay, the subject of the speech is ultimately just the parallels between John Brown and these quote unquote religious fanatics or these quote unquote religious terrorists. All right, Horowitz seems to imply his purpose is to attempt to illustrate the commonalities between the two and the danger of honoring John Brown because of the precedent that honoring such a man sets. Okay, does that make sense? He is not saying he is not saying that John Brown trying to free the slaves is the same as Islamic fanatic terrorist killing innocent people in order to try and bring about the dominion of the rightly guided caliph. Okay, those are not the same things. Horowitz understands those are not the same things, but he does see and point out a kind of similarity in the justification behind both groups' radical actions, radical violent actions. Okay, so let's take a quick look at Horowitz's argument here. Okay, so it's published in the New York Times. It's an old article, but it's on file, so you can read it online if you want to. But it's also published on page 753 of your textbook. Okay, so in the beginning of the argument, right, essentially. What Horowitz is saying is that John Brown, who he calls the most successful terrorist in American history, that is because the goal of a terrorist is to destabilize and catalyze war. That's what terror activity is, to terrorize and destabilize a society with the goal of cultivating warfare. So, in the same way that Brown's goal was to cultivate a kind of war against slavery and slaveholders, again, the extent to which he wanted to do that is kind of up for debate. He seems to claim that he wasn't really trying to do that, although his actions tend to kind of deny that fact. All right, much in the same way, the Islamic terrorists behind the attacks of 9/11, and indeed Al Qaeda as a whole, and indeed terror cells like ISIS, their whole goal is the point of their terrorism, the moral justification behind their terrorism, which, by the way, has a kind of theological and moral justification. They are human beings who want some kind of moral coherency in their actions as well, which is insane. It's so interesting that these men are so persuaded that what they're doing is right, it's righteous. Their goal is to using terrorism to initiate a war that will bring peace on earth, that will bring about the rightly guided caliph's dominion over all of the earth. Okay, the only way that can happen is if the unrighteous worldly powers of the West that do not honor Allah, that do not honor Allah's prophet Muhammad, are vanquished from the face of the earth. That's us, guys. Okay, in other words, very similar to that, right? Brown's goal was to create war. That's something that makes Horowitz very uncomfortable with honoring Brown. War was not a last resort for Brown, but rather something that he was actively trying to initiate. Okay, well, that ought to be considered in one's defense of Brown's actions. All right. I think an individual like Thoreau, with his unequivocal defense of Brown, would perhaps reject this argument by Horowitz. But in order to do so, all right, if you are going to, like Thoreau, reject Horowitz's concern here, then you probably need to give me some good reasons why it should be rejected. Okay, another kind of similarity that Horowitz points out is that Brown and the strike force of the 9/11 hijackers are similarly small. And, okay, listen, this is important, that they're not backed by any governing institution or a democratic government that offers a kind of justification or declaration of a group's intention to make war on another group of people. Okay? So this points to a larger concept that I want to unpack about warfare in a democratic society. Okay? So warfare in a democratic society is justified whenever it aligns with the judgment, the better judgment of the group of people as a whole. That is why the executive branch in the United States of America cannot, which is headed up by one individual, the president cannot simply declare war on whoever he wants to, whenever he wants to. Like, for example, right, if we elected, for some dumb reason, a tyrannical individual that wanted to conquer and colonize the rest of the Western Hemisphere, okay, that individual legally could not declare war on, say, Venezuela and go and conquer them and steal their oil reserves because of his own volition, because of his own belief that, I don't know, some deeply held belief about the American exceptionality and why we need to govern the entire Western Hemisphere. Okay, no matter how much one person believes that, they don't get to make the decision to initiate violent warfare for themselves on behalf of everyone else. You want to know how war is declared and justified? Okay, in a democratic society such as ours, the legislature has to declare war. In other words, the individuals, a group of individuals, come together, not just one person, but a group of individuals who represent a variety of American citizens. All right, the Senate and the House have to declare war, representing the better judgment of the people as a whole. And therefore, all violence that follows that declaration becomes justified because it is backed by an institution that reflects the values and will of the people that it is designed to represent. Okay? So there's a kind of stopgap against, right, one man believing something deeply and then taking violent action whenever he sees that his society does not, according to his belief system, mirror his understanding of justice. The danger of that, the danger that Horowitz is pointing out of Thoreau's line of reasoning is that any man at any point can look at his society and say, this is unjust. This such and such a law is unjust. And because it is unjust, it undermines the authority of this government as a whole, and therefore I need not submit to it, and I cannot rest. It is my duty to not rest until that injustice be rectified by whatever means necessary. That doesn't lead to peace and flourishing and life. Rather, that leads to a kind of reign of terror, in which individuals, right, who inevitably are going to have differing understandings of the way things ought to be, are constantly in violent conflict with one another, attempting to build a world that imitates or mimics their own understanding of the good or their own understanding of justice. Okay? So this is a significant argument, all right, and a significant parallel that both of these individuals, right, Horowitz doesn't get into this. Obviously, I'm using Horowitz as a jumping off point, just as you should in your synthetic argument. Okay, that's how you use these sources. They're jumping off points. In the same way that Horowitz emphasizes the smallness of the fighting cells, the guerrilla nature of the fighting, the fact that these are not backed by governing authorities that represent the will of the people, but rather take it upon themselves to say, my view of that which is just should be represented and brought about by whatever means necessary, and whoever has to die because my understanding of the good is the good. Okay? In a democratic society, there's always negotiation required. Okay? There's always a kind of communal dialogue that is required, even and especially even when that the issues are about the things that we hold most deeply true. Okay? So, again, complicated individual Brown, complicated implications of both dishonoring him and honoring him. And I'd like for you to develop your own nuanced perspective of how he ought to be approached. Okay, obviously you need to fill out your outline, developing your central claim and your series of supporting claims and summary of evidence that helps solidify and substantiate your line of reasoning. Okay, boy, I probably showed a few too many cards today, but alas, it's an interesting subject, and sometimes when I get going, can't stop. All right, I hope you guys are doing really well. I miss hanging out with you guys in class. I genuinely wish that we could be reunited this year, but I am grateful that we get to continue our work, and I hope that you do so as best as you possibly can during these strange times. All right, have an excellent day, and make sure you leave a meaningful comment.